The federal government funds these. And what we've known is that many of the schools, a parliamentary budget officer says, are in very poor condition. In fact, we have had some schools that don't even have a reliable source of water. Only 35% of First Nations homes have broadband access in the middle of a pandemic.
She's one of Canada's most prominent voices for First Nations children and youth. Now, Cindy Blackstock says in the aftermath of the discovery of student remains at the Kamloops Indian Residential School, Canada must now deal with both the legacy of residential schools and the present reality of First Nations education.
Many of the schools have black mold problems, they have rodent issues, and they need to be replaced. On top of that, there's inequalities in terms of the education funding itself, funding for libraries, equipment, teacher salaries, those kinds of things.
Blackstock says the Indian Act puts responsibility for funding Indigenous education firmly in federal hands. A 2013 Queen's University paper reported federally funded schools on reserves and in remote communities often received less money than provincially funded schools. In 2016, the Parliamentary Budget Officer estimated the funding gap at $336 to $665 million.
Because of the funding gap, because they are funding at lower levels than the rest of the country, the opportunity, or at least the prospect for them to enter into post-secondary education is considerably lowered.
Veldon Coburn says Canada has been here before. In 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples had a funding plan to close the educational gap for First Nations within 20 years. But then Finance Minister Paul Martin instead cut funding for the then Department of Indian and Northern Affairs.
Demographically, we should have seen almost sort of equal footing of probably, well, at least opportunities anyways for Indigenous students by the time that they were 20 at this point. So infants that were born in 96. However, the gap still remains.
You know, a non-Indigenous child once told me, they said, you know what discrimination is? Discrimination is when the government doesn't think you're worth the money. So what would it feel like if you were one of those kids who wasn't worth the money, or the parent of a child who wasn't worth the money? That's the lived reality of First Nations children today.
In Ottawa, Xiaoli Li, City News.